little bit too much fun.
Okay, we're going to get going.
Whenever you call.
Okay, good morning.
Good morning. At this time, we will be convening the Transportation Funding Ad Hoc Committee. For Thursday, June 16th. And clerk, please call the roll.
Mayor Burke.
Here.
Councilmember Holman.
Here.
Councilmember Ness.
Here.
Vice Mayor Sharp.
Here.
Four present.
All right. So we have for today's discussion the results of the polling, any additional outreach information, and then moving forward with whatever it is that the committee will be recommending to the council and in what form. So should we start with the outreach update and then the polling? Does that make sense? Or
Yeah, the outreach update's very, very quick, but
We haven't really had new responses to the online survey. Primarily last week has been devoted to completing the public opinion survey, so that's our primary focus here.
okay.
And we have Miranda Everett, who's with FM3 on the line, who I think some of you know, and is going to walk through the results of the second poll. And Miranda, we have your slides up on the on a PowerPoint on our screen, so I can push that for you. We also have hard copies, so you let me know how you want to run that.
Okay, well, I'll just walk through it and mention slide numbers as I go, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Great.
Okay.
All right, so here to talk about the Palo Alto voter support for a transportation finance measure. Results are hot off the presses. We conducted the survey through just this Tuesday, June 11th through 14th. And if you go to slide 1, methodology, we conducted 400 interviews with likely voters for the November 16 election in Palo Alto. Conducted them on landline and cell phones. The number we conducted, that gives us a margin of error of plus or minus 4.9%. Any questions about methodology before we move on?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Great, so slide 2, we just had a brief warm-up question. Good news here, 61% feel that things in the city are going in the right direction. Only 25% say the wrong track.
Could I ask, did we do the same question the last time?
Similar.
We did not. I think we
did a
asked
similar.
approval ratings and things like that instead.
So it's slightly differently worded?
Yeah, this is asking more generally about direction rather than approval of certain organizations.
There's something that was sort of similar, gave some concept about how well the city was doing. It may not have been exactly
Yeah,
this.
quality of life or, yeah.
There was something related to that. Okay.
So it's generally optimism. That's good. So slide 3, we are moving straight into the traffic congestion relief measure. Slide 4 has the results and the ballot measure language we tested. You can see here there's soft support for a traffic congestion relief measure. 65% total yes, 36% of those definitely. About half of your yes voters are probably or undecided, so that's why we characterize it as a bit of a soft support. Your total no's are 28%. Half of those are definitely no's, so a little bit stronger there, even though there are fewer of them. And you've got a good number of 6% who are undecided.
Okay.
On slide 5, we presented some additional information about the mechanism, what it would pay for, how it would work, and that is what voters heard. On slide 6, we have the results of asking the vote question again. It's essentially unchanged. We moved up 2 points on the yes side and 1 point on the no side, so you just took a couple out of undecided, but essentially no change there within the margin of error. Slide 7, we asked voters whether they would prefer a measure that funds alternatives to driving or to just making it easier to drive, and a plurality, 48%, that they would prefer alternatives getting cars off the road. 12% said both. They weren't offered that choice, but they offered it anyway. So if you add those in, you've got a majority who want to see cars off the road with this measure. Turning to messaging and movement, on slide 9, you have a line graph of yes and no and undecided votes and how those track initially after support messages and after opposition messages. And here you can see there is a bit of a bump in support after the positive messaging and a little bit of receding in the no vote, but that resets right back after the opposition messages. In fact, the no vote goes up to about a third after opposition. We'll take a closer look at what those messages are, starting on slide 10 and 11. Those are the positives. So slide 12 shows you how these rank in terms of convincingness as a reason to vote for the measure. Fairness is right there at the top. 47% called that very convincing reason to vote for it. 77% called it very or somewhat. So the fairness, the neighborhoods, and the retention of shoppers and businesses, you can see all of those figures are higher than your yes votes, or even convincing some undecided or some no voters with those messages. Slide 13 has a list of opposition messages that we tested and what those were.
You still there, Miranda?
Yeah, I'll just give you a second to read
Okay.
it. Okay. Slide 14, arguments against the measure. The assertion that the measure is rushed is seen as persuasive to nearly 2/3, and a third called that a very convincing argument. That one really stands out compared with the other ones we tested. Notably, the VTA measure, it's right there in the middle. It's not standing out, but the sense that the measure, once they hear that it's a rushed plan, that really seems to resonate with voters. So slide 15 and 16, just to show you some other options we also tested briefly. Business tax based on revenue receipts got 50% support. Sales tax, 32% support, and parcel and UUT taxes got even less support. So often when we test just a conceptual measure after a fuller test of a long one, we see negative results, but not nearly so clear cut. So it truly seems like the choice there is not one of these.
They feel pretty strongly about the utility tax, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, and those are hard sell, and usually without the context and arguments back and forth, or even some information about what a UUT really is, folks are pretty resistant at first. Slide 17, just looking at other scenarios. We also looked at a non-presidential turnout, so likely 2018 voter model, and that had a very similar vote share. So you have 61% saying total yes, your definites are still about half there. Your total no is 32%, 7% undecided.
Yeah.
All of that is within
Where is
the margin
that?
of error.
I think
Miranda, we don't have that slide in front of us, so I think
Yeah.
you're going to need to describe that data a little more fully. I don't think that latest version of the presentation made it.
And it's not in the accompanying data
Survey.
set, right? The survey.
No.
I was very interested in that one.
Yeah, this
this is-
based on an
was a-
analysis of the underlying data. So.
maybe you could just verbally explain that. We don't have that in what you sent over.
Sure, yeah, I sent it earlier this
She's
morning.
okay.
So
Right, sorry.
on this slide, you see the vote
Look
question,
at it.
and you've got definitely probably undecided yes, 33% definitely, 21% probably, 7% lean yes.
On
For a
what
total
again?
of 61% total.
Can you go through that again?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, wait, just
Yeah.
a sec. I don't know if we're clear what those numbers are referring to.
That is looking at a turnout model for a 2018 election. So a non-presidential but an even year election. So if you were to wait for the 2018, this is what we might expect to see.
Miranda, can you email?
Actually, is it possible to email that to David Carnahan? We don't have that in what you sent.
Yes, I can do that.
Okay.
You should have it from this morning. But David Conahan, you said?
Carnahan.
Carnahan, okay.
So that's the one
No.
that's about what happens if we wait?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
That's
let's
what
just
if we
get the
wait?
email done so that we'll have that in front of us when we discuss.
Do you want her to
So
mail it?
Miranda, it's David,
Do you have- oh,
DAVID
Charles has it.
dot CARNAHAN at cityofpaloalto.org.
Okay, I just sent that off.
I sent it too, so.
Okay.
You already had to that?
I do, but it needs to
Okay.
get to that computer
Yeah.
to project, so.
Yeah, great.
And it's slide 17.
Can you go put that one and this one on input 2?
This is missing 2 slides, 16 and 17. It goes from 15 to 19. Missing 2 slides. This is. Is there 16? 16. That's a 16. 17. Okay. 18.
We went through that, so it should be slide, that one, 17.
Okay.
Okay, Miranda, we have the slide up now.
Okay, great. So this slide just looks at the same vote question, but takes a model assuming 2018. So not those who come out for every presidential election, but who come out for those even year elections. And here we see 61% yes, 32% no overall, undecided. It is all essentially the same patterns within the margin of error that we are seeing for a November electorate.
So the margin of error on this is what? Because I think we had, this is by comparison to the original question where we had a 65% support, is that correct?
Right, and the margin of error of the full sample is about 5%. So if there's a smaller subsample, it would be a bit higher. So all we can say, I mean, what we can say with confidence here is that it is not particularly different if you were to put it on a 2018 ballot.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, that's a 2018 ballot. That's not an off-year ballot.
Yeah, but I also ran data. I don't have a slide for it because we did it really quickly this morning, but I have data for an off-year election. That one, we see the same pattern again up front. We see 64% yes, 30% no, 6% undecided. So again, within that margin of error. And notably, after the positives, that vote share rises to 71% with those voters.
Okay.
So turning to slide 18 and 19, we also examined the VTA, the countywide measure, to see what kind of impact the citywide measure might have on it. The first slide here, number 19, has the initial ask, which we actually asked ahead of the local measure in the survey because that's how it would be on the ballot. 75% yes here, 43% definitely yes, so a much stronger showing here. 21% no on this measure. So this is a good result among your voters. Slide 20 has the comparison. So on the left is the results we just saw. On the right is the vote we asked again after the back and forth about the city measure. It does lose a bit of support after they hear about the local tax. Support comes especially out of that definitely category. You lose about 6 points from the definitely yes side, and you pick up 4 points on the definitely no. So turning to conclusions on slide 22, the measure does begin with support from nearly 2/3 of voters, but about half as many are definitely yes as are leaning. So it really does rely on those soft yeses. Informational messaging brings the measure to 72% yes, but support remains soft even then. Opposition argumentation again reduces that overall yes share and its intensity to the original 2/3. The most effective messages stress the impact of congestion on local neighborhoods and explain the direct benefit to businesses on customers and employees. The strongest opposition message we saw by far was a claim that the measure is rushed or maybe that it is a blank check. Given the choice, a plurality does prefer funding alternatives to driving. Other finance mechanisms we tested were largely unpopular after a brief test. And the countywide measure has solid support from 3/4, though it erodes a little bit slightly after they hear about a second potential measure on the city level. And now I'm happy to take questions or discuss any of this further.
Great, thanks. Who would like to kick off? Liz and then Greg?
So, it's you, Melissa, isn't it? Miranda, sorry. So, Miranda, if you, in your own words, had to say, we tested this now about a month ago, you gave us your reactions then, how would you indicate that this gives us a different picture than it did before? Or do you see it kind of looking not too different at all?
So I would think here, and given that we have the 75 words, I feel this is a much more accurate sort of test, especially as we get closer to the election as well. I'll note that this is modeled on the assumption that, like with previous measures in your community and most that we see statewide, there's no organized opposition. If the city can get out there and communicate the benefits of this to businesses, can really explain the mechanism clearly and get those groups on board without an active funded campaign against them, it is possible to move those leaners into that yes column. But I will say that we do view the results with a little bit of caution just because of that dependence on leaners and because of the potential power of opposition argumentation. The leading no argument that the measure is rushed is one that we really saw resonate with folks. And we'll take a closer look at who those voters are. But the fact that 64% called that convincing that's the kind of the share you're relying on for a yes vote it does give us pause, I think.
So you don't see this, I'm not really hearing you again, Miranda. Are you saying, yes, you hear this as quite a different take on the community? And as far as there being no opposition, I don't think there's opposition yet because we haven't decided to do it yet.
So,
Right. And
Randy, you want me to weigh in with a few thoughts on what we've discussed about the nature of the results?
yeah, and I'll bring up the previous survey results and have those handy too.
Sure.
In a second. So go ahead.
I mean, I think, so the initial survey looked at sort of the idea of this measure at a conceptual level. Now we've taken that concept, boiled it down into the form that it would actually appear on the ballot, and I think we're seeing similar levels of support, right? So support around that 2/3 mark, at the point where I think we feel fairly comfortable in an environment where it's a general tax requiring a simple majority, still on the bubble for something that would require a 2/3 vote, right? So I think those conclusions which came out of the initial survey hold true here. Now, what we've accomplished in this survey that we didn't in the initial survey was to expose the measure to the type of discussion and debate that would occur in an election, right? So on the pro side, we see that support does rise when this measure is backed by an active, well-funded campaign to articulate why voters should support this, and there's some very compelling reasons why voters would support this. Fairness around the business community contributing to the transportation problem, et cetera. But I think what we're also finding is that there's a pretty glaring vulnerability to this measure too. One, about half of the support that we're seeing for the measure when we read the ballot question is what we call soft support, meaning that these are people saying they would probably vote yes, or initially they're undecided, and only when pushed they say that they lean towards yes, right? Those are the types of voters that would be vulnerable to an opposition campaign, which is why I think Miranda is highlighting that risk to you, that if there were well-funded, well-organized, professional opposition to this measure, that would create some vulnerabilities. And there's, of all the negatives that we tested that could be used against this measure, the process issue of the fact that this has come together quickly, it's rushed, it may not be well thought through. If there, again, were resources devoted to hammering that message consistently, you could see some of that soft support erode. So as I looked at this data, I see sort of three potential paths forward. One is we continue on the path to November 2016. We need to do that with our eyes open, that just by virtue of this process, we've exposed a vulnerability that could become a problem for us. And it's hard to handicap at this point what level of opposition we would encounter, but we've certainly heard some concerns raised by folks in the community. The other thing we need to think about in the context of November 2016 is the impact on the VTA measure, right? So we saw the VTA measure at the start of the survey start at 75% and erode to 69% after there was this discussion and debate around a local transportation proposal. So Palo Alto represents about 5% of the voters in Santa Clara County where the VTA measure would be on the ballot. That 5% erosion among the 5% of voters in the county represents about a 0.25% decline in overall support for the VTA measure. So relatively insignificant, although I look back at the 2008 VTA sales tax, the last time they had one on the ballot, that measure passed with 66.78% of the vote, so by about 0.1%. So shave off 0.25%, and that measure goes from a winner to a loser. So,
although the leadership group has shared with everyone that this current measure is polling the highest of any measure they've ever had.
Fair point.
Far higher than that one.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. But at the 2/3 measure, at the 2/3 level, 0.25% does make a difference, right? These measures rarely win by a landslide.
That one also was in November of 2008.
Yes.
And that was right after September and October of 2008.
Very different economic environment, absolutely. So that's sort of the dynamic that I see in November 2016. The other options are, support in this poll, we are within striking distance of 2/3. So if we were to look at 2017 as an option, you can't do the general tax, right? So we're only in a special tax 2/3 environment then. It does allow more time for a process that would then take that primary vulnerability about the rush nature of this measure potentially off the table. So taking away your primary vulnerability could be a good option. In order to reach 2/3, I think you have to be able to neutralize opposition, right? So is moving forward in 2017, having a more thoughtful process and eliminating opposition an option? Possibly. I think it's something worth considering. And then as Miranda described, we don't see much in the way of eroded support if you move away from the high turnout presidential general election this year to a relatively high turnout but lower turnout election in the gubernatorial general election in 2018. And again, that timeline would allow for a process that would potentially take that rushed vulnerability off the table too. So those are the three scenarios that I see coming out of this
Good.
data.
Thanks.
Greg?
So that was very helpful, thanks, and got to some of my concerns. So let's assume for a moment that there is a strong opposition and it's well-funded and well-organized, as you said. And let's assume on the city side, there's some obviously a ballot statement, but there's no mailers, no real flyers, maybe. There's a campaign for it, but it's not well-funded. How much of that soft support, do you have a sense of how much of that soft support could erode? What's the likely scenario like that?
Yeah. It's hard to quantify, right, to know exactly how much of that support you would lose. I can tell you that, in the half dozen or so bond and tax measures I've worked on for Palo Alto Unified School District, where we're in a 2/3 environment and we have encountered some level of opposition, typically the pro side spends, somewhere in the neighborhood of $120,000 to $150,000 on mailers and advertising and whatnot in order to shore up support to make sure these measures are
Say the pro
successful.
side spends like 10,000. Yeah.
Right. Well, in reflecting
For the
back to the TOT measure here in 2014, I worked with council members Klein and Berman, and I think we raised a grand total of about $5,000 to do a little bit of internet advertising and to write an argument in favor. If that's the pro side and there's $150,000 spent on the no side, it's hard to hold on to that half of your support, which is soft support, right?
So then, my other question is, if that scenario happened, you had the well-organized, opposition, and does that bleed over to the county, to the VTA tax? I mean, does this get worse as support for this tax starts to fall? Do we know the answer to that? If there's a well-funded opposition to this, the 5,000, 10,000 pro on this, but that message keeps getting hammered home, does that affect our VTA tax? Could it continue to fall or not?
Well, I think one of the reasons why we're seeing support locally for the VTA tax go from 75 to 69 is because of the negative arguments that voters are hearing about the local transportation proposal are impacting how they're thinking about not just this tax, but all taxes, right? So
it could get worse, the fall for the VTA tax.
Again, it's really hard to quantify that, but I would expect that there would be a generally negative trend.
All right. Yeah. Let's see, I had some other questions, but not about polling. So let's finish the polling questions. So if you want to.
Okay, Karen?
Yeah, a couple of questions. Do you recall what the percentage of voter approval was for the TOT ultimately? Because that had opposition. And how
I'll
the
look it
polling-
up, but I believe it was about 75% yes.
And that was, what did it poll before the campaign? Do you recall? Did you have that?
It was a similar number, although I would characterize that opposition as not well funded. We didn't see advertising, mailings, things of that nature against that measure. What we saw was an argument against in the voter pamphlet. And that was about the extent of it.
Okay. And I think the question, when I read it earlier and glanced at it today, I think the argument that this would pair or marry with the VTA measure. That seems to be a strong argument for how, the VTA measure covers some things and the local measure would cover other things that would marry with that.
Yep.
Would you see that as like one of the strongest things for us to focus on?
Yeah, that's certainly one of the positives here. Let's see, that specific item is the county is placing a measure on the ballot to fund improvements to Caltrain, VTA, freeways. Palo Alto has a unique opportunity to pair its share of this county funding with city investments to improve local parking and traffic. Yeah, that's one of the stronger arguments in favor, so that could be part of a campaign.
And what slide was that?
Slide 11 is the description of that measure. It's the one labeled paired.
Yeah.
Second from the bottom.
Okay. And the support for that, I did read this earlier, but it's a lot of slides. So where's the percentage?
It's on the next slide,
It's
12.
the second to the bottom, 65.
Yeah, 65% of voters said that was very or somewhat convincing.
Okay. All right. Good. Okay. Thank you. I think that's it for the moment.
Okay, this Pat, I have a few questions. One is that I saw that we had the question about how voters would vote for this measure if it came up in 2018 or I guess even an off year. But I didn't see the question that was a big one for us, which is asking voters how they would feel about waiting 2 years to address whatever they saw as transportation problems if we didn't have the funding and the measure at this time. So was there anything that gave any sense of the answer to that question? Any of the polling questions?
So I think that can be a difficult question for voters because there are some who will talk on and on about community problems and still be unwilling to support a tax for entirely other reasons. I think we got to a couple different parts of the issue when we talk about need. Question 8, that argument, 33% found that a very convincing argument. 71 said very or somewhat, but we really didn't present them with the choice or kind of a scary scenario necessarily.
Because it's essentially the counterpoint to the rushed argument, and this is what we're struggling with. On the one hand, there's an argument that it's a rush measure. On the other hand, there's an argument that if it doesn't go on this ballot, then it may wait 2 years, and we don't address these problems in the same way for that time frame. So that's the flip side of that same question about rushed. So it doesn't sound like we really have any answers that inform us on that flip side to it.
The closest we get to that idea is this item on slide 11, labeled need, which is the city is currently spending millions each year on improving streets, sidewalks, bicycle and pedestrian safety programs, but traffic and parking problems keep getting worse. The additional funding provided by this measure is needed if we're going to address this problem. That sort of gets to the, we got a problem that's not getting better. It's urgent. Unless we do something, it's only going to get worse.
So then, also on the rushed argument, it looked like it was a question of, does an argument that something is rushed resonate, as opposed to a specific argument about this measure, why it is being rushed, or that it is in fact being rushed. It didn't sound like it was a kind of a fact-based argument. It was just a question of, does an argument that something is rushed resonate? Was there more to it than that?
Well, you see the text of what we tested there. Unfortunately, our opponents don't have the obligation to be fully truthful. And so we want to test something that would mirror what it would actually be said on that side of the argument. 13. And so that's what we attempted to do with that. I'll note that I was just looking at this. Among the folks who moved to a no vote from a yes vote, 52% of them found that a very convincing argument.
Okay. And then after, when we got at the end and we had the 66% support after everything was said and done, is that right?
66.
Yeah. Does that include after the rushed argument had been made to the?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, at that point, everyone had heard that argument.
Okay. And then one of the things about, we appreciate that each of the polls get more refined and more meaningful. What I realize is that on the VTA question, we ask a question that's asked of all voters in the county. But there is a different orientation to the VTA tax, which is what are the benefits to Palo Alto from the VTA tax? And in our case, it's really most of all $1 billion toward Caltrain and grade separations. So that's not something that we made a distinction on, but I suspect the VTA tax would resonate even more with our local voters if they understood that this is the first VTA tax that really did a lot for Palo Alto.
Sure, and here we're trying to test as close as we can the 75 words without stepping on toes there. So we tested a conceptual measure that's close to what they see on the ballot. So this assumes they go in, they haven't heard a back and forth, they don't have a lot of information about specific benefits to them, but they're just reading what's there and in the case of this measure, they can't itemize on that 75 words what each city is going to get.
Yeah, and that's what we agreed you were going to poll. It's just in further thought on seeing this, I realize that there's probably a follow-up question that would be interesting to know. Okay, let's see. I think that covers my initial questions on the poll. We have a number of speakers, so maybe we should go ahead and switch to hearing the speakers, then come back to discussion. Does that sound good?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So we have 5 speaker cards. Anybody else want to speak? So each speaker has up to 3 minutes to speak. Our first speaker is Nielsen Buchanan.
Thank you, Pat. My activity as a community organization has reached a zenith. I've been phoned twice on these polls, so I've responded twice, and I'm one of the more enthusiastic supporters of this measure. The only thing I hedged on is I thought there was an imbalance between mitigation measures, bicycles versus non-bicycle solutions. I'll never attack the commitments to bikes as they are in Palo Alto, but I will attack that the other mitigation measures are woefully underfunded. It's irrational if you look at the capital investment in bikes versus non-bike modalities. Nobody could have responded more yes than I did. I'll leave it up to the council to decide what's going to be best in this particular point in time. I quote Mayor Burt, late in one council meeting, he said, if you like traffic and parking now, wait 2 or 3 years and see what it's going to be like if we don't pass these mitigation measures sooner than later. The only way out is Greg Scharf's observation that we may be headed for economic winter, so I guess we could weather through the situation. The root of this dilemma is the failure of the planning department and the city council to have forecast information so that the voters would be informed on what the traffic and parking would be like rolling forward in the future. I assure you, out there in voter land, there's just really there's confusion about what should be objective data. How many effed up intersections are there going to be? What's the parking demand? So far, the planning department and the council has not addressed forward-looking data in any kind of modern management process. I don't understand it because private business does that kind of forecasting all the time. Not asking for long-term forecasts, just forecast parking and traffic 3, 4, 5 years out, and you'll be getting different responses from this poll. Finally, let me just make a prediction that I've got a feeling the council's going to punt on this measure for a whole lot of different reasons. The opposition will be overwhelming. The residents are not going to, and voters are not going to be as organized as they should be. I think that if Pat Burt wants to run again for council in 2018, I'd be happy to be on his committee because it's going to take that kind of leadership to turn this ship around, assuming we don't have economic winter. What we're going to be faced with is either start mitigation to the council, or what's going to be happening is you're going to see opposition to development like you've never seen before, project by project. There are going to be appeals, slow things down more than you've already slowed it down. And we appreciate the exemption removals, moratoriums, but they're not adequate if this economic boom continues. I hate to be punitive in the way I phrase that, but I don't see the situation changing. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Peter Stone, to be followed by Charles Melton. Welcome.
Thank you, Mayor Burt, council members. I have just a couple of points that I wanted to make. One is that I'm sure some of you know that the VTA tax has been 3 years in gestation. The original list of potential projects was of great multiple of what is finally proposed to be funded. It's been a pretty deliberative process with probably hundreds of meetings with various stakeholder groups trying to refine what that measure will fund, which I think is frankly a responsible approach to take when you're asking voters to approve higher taxes. And although the chamber hasn't taken a position yet, it's on our agenda for next week. I predict with high confidence that the chamber will endorse the VTA measure. And that brings me to my second point, which is that given that the VTA measure requires a 2/3 vote, every Palo Alto vote that switches from the yes column to the no column counts 3 times, because what was a yes vote becomes a no vote that's weighted double a yes vote. So I think Even though the poll suggests that the effect won't be large, I think that it's right for those of us who support the VTA measure to be concerned about the impact.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Charles Melton, to be followed by Judy Kleinberg.
Thank you, Mayor Burt and City Council members, for this opportunity to address you today. I'm Charles Melton, the Director of Tax Policy and Government Relations with the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, and I'm here to speak on behalf of our 400 member companies. This week, we submitted to this committee a letter highlighting the Leadership Group's principal tax criteria. We look forward to any questions or comments you have on the criteria we have put forward. As illustrated in this letter, following this criteria paves the path for the creation of an equitable, even-handed, and effective tax measure. One key discussion this committee has yet to engage is the impact this proposed tax measure might have on local businesses within the city of Palo Alto. We would welcome the opportunity to work with you to consider the impact this proposed tax measure could have on the operation of privately operated bus transit routes, the value of this tax in funding the transportation projects it seeks to complete, and the potential burden this tax will place on many small businesses looking to grow or simply hire additional employees to help during the summer or holiday seasons. The Leadership Group also strongly encourages this committee to publish the specifics of their potential tax proposal and allow for additional feedback from the Palo Alto community prior to their tax moving to the City Council for their consideration. Additionally, we commend the Mayor and Council for your public comments, ensuring that this potential tax will not negatively impact the passage of the VTA traffic relief measure, which is already qualified for the November 8th ballot. We greatly appreciate your support of the VTA traffic relief measure and your commitment to its passage. Seeing your most recent survey results, it is apparent that a Palo Alto specific tax would drive down the countywide traffic relief measure by 6 points, from 75% to 69% support. We all recognize how much the countywide measure directly benefits Palo Alto and North County. We also know that passing a 2/3 measure countywide is already difficult, and every vote counts, especially those right here in Palo Alto. Based on the impacts we see in this poll today, it gives us great pause about a local Palo Alto tax. The Leadership Group looks forward to continuing to work with you and to provide additional feedback throughout the course of your deliberations.
Thank you. And quick question, Charles. Your letter, your third and fourth bullets seem to be under the impression that we were pursuing a parcel tax. You're clear that that's not the case, right?
I'm clear that you guys are not considering a parcel tax. That is something that has been discussed within this committee. These are the criteria we use in evaluating all tax measures.
Okay, so these are formulaic. All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Judy Kleinberg.
Thank you, Mayor and council people. I'm just following on what Peter Stone, our chair of our board, said. We have not taken a position officially on either of the VTA tax or this potential business tax here in Palo Alto. What we have discussed it thoroughly. It is a major part of our discussions. And as Mr. Stone said, we are poised and almost certainly going to endorse and work very hard for the VTA tax. It is specific. It has major points of benefit for Palo Alto and commuters in and out of Palo Alto, and that's the kind of tax that we think voters will support. We would be very concerned if there was some other measure on the ballot that would erode support for that benefit to the businesses in Palo Alto, large and small. I also want to add that originally, I may be wrong, but I recall the genesis of this business tax was to help fund the TMA. I want to encourage you to think back to that original thinking. The TMA is a specific use for the tax money. I think businesses can recognize direct benefits to the down. I'm already out, Pat?
No, I hadn't set the timer, so you'll
I'm almost done, so it's all right. I got it. They would recognize specific benefits, especially to the downtown commuters, shoppers, and businesses. And so the TMA, although, again, we've taken no position on it, but originally there was some rationale that businesses could recognize because there was a specific use and outcome for the measure. Lastly, I want to say that a tax measure without a sunset is almost certainly going to be opposed. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker and final speaker is Herb Borak.
Mayor Burton, committee members, the questions asked in the poll about the VTA tax was based upon what is the best argument to get Palo Alto voters to support it. But that's not the 75 words the voters are going to see on the ballot. It's going to mention BART. And having the council make a decision based in part on a poll that omits the fact that the VTA tax is about BART, I think will lead to a problem down the road, because it's as if you're trying to get a specific answer out of the poll to justify putting the local tax measure by hiding the fact that the VTA measure is primarily, the main purpose is for BART. And I think it would have been better if you had actual language for a potential ballot measure countywide that would indicate what that tax is really for, rather than the argument that you might make in Palo Alto for that tax. And that would give you a better idea both of the potential vote in Palo Alto for the countywide measure with and without a local measure on the ballot. Thank you.
Thank you. So that concludes our public comments. As we come back to our discussion, one of the things we need to think about is what is it that we're trying to accomplish today, and what have we really been tasked by the council to do. And I don't know, David, if you might be able to dig back up the motion from the last meeting, but it strikes me, and maybe we should just have a little preliminary discussion on what we want to try to provide. Ultimately, I think the full council is going to want to have a pretty full discussion on this, and we could do either one of two things or both, which is we could make a specific recommendation and take our vote on that as a committee. I suspect it might be more meaningful for us to help the council frame the issues and just really set forth for them kind of better thought through set of pros and cons, so that they don't have to wade through all of the same kinds of considerations we do, that we can tee it up for a meaningful discussion at council rather than assume that whatever we decide here, they'll defer to us. I don't think that's going to happen. I think they're going to want to do their own thinking on this, and so us framing the issues might be the most productive thing to do. So I don't know what folks think about it.
So I would agree with you, Pat.
Okay.
Yes.
And I would agree as well. Yes.
Okay. Great. Who would like to go first? Oh, time's up. No.
Can I ask one question
Sure.
first? So it's a non-polling question, but and I'll frame it in that one of the thoughts in our head is whether or not we do this in 2016, whether or not we do it in 2017, or whether or not we do that in 2018. And if we go ahead and put it on the ballot now and say it passes, that's in November, when would the effective date be? And what does staff need to do to get the tax collected, to get an administration and all of that? So when we talk about, the biggest vulnerability on this was that it's rushed. So the question really is, when is staff going to would they have this all together, as opposed to if we did it in 2017 or 2008? How much time do we actually lose by doing 2017 or 2018? And I wanted to ask staff that.
Well, and can I add to that, though, we need to understand whether, whenever it goes on the ballot, would there be the same lag between when it's...
Right, you're right. I was making an assumption staff could start working on that and get that if we put it, but that may not be correct. So if they could address that.
Well, perhaps just to give you a sense of the conversations we have had to this point, and a few of us had a chance to chat with Jim about that specific point, I think that if the presumption were that with the 2016 election that implementation could happen, say, as early as January 2017, that would be really challenging. And certainly the need to establish both through the ballot as well as administratively the specific definitions how a program would be administered would take some time. In addition, there would be the staff resources that would be required in order to administer the program itself, both in terms of the handling of receipts as well as enforcement requirements. So I think it would certainly take some time. Targeting the January 2018 timeframe would be more certainly viable, both in terms of the time it would take to put together the program, as well as if you take the assumption that it would take some additional resources, the time it would take to both budget as well as put that in place.
So the second part of it was really, Pat sort of raised the issue as well. If we took the time and put it on the 2017 ballot, could we still target January 1st, 2018 if we worked through that and we started now? And then I'm going to ask the same question for if we put it on the 2018 ballot, could we have it go January 1st, 2019? Because we could do the work beforehand, or we couldn't do the work beforehand. That's the question.
I think certainly the ability to do the work beforehand exists with any of those scenarios. So with council direction on how this proceeds, irrespective of the potential lag between an election and when the implementation date would be, that any additional time would certainly give us the opportunity to be in a better position.
Can I ask a follow-up? Go ahead.
Yeah, a follow-up to that, and good question, thank you, Greg. No matter when, and this is my presumption, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but no matter when it goes on the ballot, no matter how much planning you can do in advance, there's still going to be, I'm going to just throw out there as a working number here, maybe 6-month lag, because you have to identify the staff that's going to be able to support and implement the programs. Is that kind of a rational way to think of it? So.
Well, in terms of identifying the staff, and again, if the assumption is that this is a permanent program, therefore we would increase the resources on a permanent basis in order to administer it, then 6 months is a typical recruitment time frame. So if you add to the recruitment and filling positions time frame also the budgeting necessary for that, then it would be at least 6 months.
And to follow on that then, if I might, is like whether it's, and we don't know yet, or I don't know yet, if it's permanent staff or if it's, contracting, but the RFP process takes a few months as well. So RFP, RFQ.
Right, and so typically that would be an either or. So if it were in-house staff, then again, I would estimate roughly a 6-month time frame for completion of that, or if it were contract, then a similar time frame for both establishment and completion of a procurement process.
Okay, thank you.
Just to follow on to that, how much staff effort could be done if, excuse me, before we actually have the voters decide? And so, for instance, say it went on a 2017 ballot that would require a 2/3 majority. I think we all assume that that would be, at best, a really close ballot measure. And so are you assuming that staff could do some significant work contingent on a successful election outcome, or would it really need to await the outcome of the election to begin that process?
Well, I think the clarity we would seek from staff standpoint in order to enable our work is council direction on the specifics of a measure. And depending on the complexity of that measure, staff can get started identifying the resources that would be necessary to administer it.
Okay. Liz?
So 2 or 3 things, and I hope we'll have a few rounds on this because this is a complicated problem also. And I think what I see as different with this one is this is an urgent problem. We've talked about this for quite a while now, and as much as housing looms out there, the traffic problem is one that we hear about on a constant basis. If there's one thing that people love to talk about in town right now, it's how terrible the traffic is, how much worse it is than it was before, how much worse it's getting. So let's talk about the VTA tax for a minute, which is well thought out, has been now, Charles, I'll bet 3 years in the planning, which I very much admire. However, and with Herb here, the lion's share of that does go to Bart. And having sat on the VTA board and watched what the VTA board can do when there isn't a sufficient amount to go around, Bart usually gets it first. And that's happened in the background and regrettably could happen in the foreground. So the part I like about this tax is it's ours, we collect it, we spend it, and it's predictable. The part I'm not liking right now is I really would like to see, as Judy Kleinberg mentioned, I'd really like to see our TMA in this, our transportation management. I feel pretty strongly about that. And Judy happened to mention it as well, as did Carl in his letter. Sunsetting something like this is really important. And no one remembers now, but the utility tax had a sunset clause in it. We never did go back to the voters, which is interesting. But it did, that was the plan at the time that went through so many years ago. So I think this has great relevance at this point in time, but I would like to, as this continues, be sure that the TMA gets included and be sure that there's a sunset in it of some type. I think voters feel far more comfortable when there's a sunset built in, and Carl, who's now done any number, I think Carl's probably done 5 of these by now that have been thought out, and going way back to Measure B in the 90s. So I'd be reasonably sure that a sunset within this would be a reassurance to the voters. We didn't test that, I know, but could I just ask our consultant whether or not this is, you've done many of these. Do you think sunset is persuasive?
I think it would enhance support for the measure, certainly. It's sort of the ultimate accountability measure for the voters that we get to reconsider this in a reasonably short time frame. We typically see that sort of the hierarchy of how voters think about taxes is, how much is it, what's it going to be used for, and sort of a distant third is how long is it going to last. But I do think that for those skeptical voters, knowing that they get a chance to reconsider it is reassuring.
Also, one last thing, the VTA tax is very different. That's a sales tax. That's going on for, and I think that one is 30 years, am I right this time? As have been the ones that are in the past. And this one is, for good or for not, this is on businesses alone. This is quite a different kind of tax. Whether the voters will see it that way or not, I don't know. So I look again to our consultant. Do you believe the voters will differentiate pretty carefully between the VTA tax for a myriad of different things, but one that is on me? I will be paying that tax.
Right.
But the other one, is the business tax. So that is on businesses per se. That does not go in, I don't know how far down we call a business, but, and by the way, I'll ask you this later, Molly, but I'm interested in knowing, are businesses in town our doctors and our lawyers? Is that a business?
Depends on how council defines it. This is one of the many significant policy questions you'll
so
need to address.
I'll leave that hang for a minute. And
I do think voters are distinguishing between, this being a tax where the cost burden is on businesses as opposed to the sales tax where it's spread more broadly. And I think that's supported by the idea that the most persuasive argument in favor of the measure is that Palo Alto is one of the only cities in the Bay Area that does not charge a business tax to provide funding to help address issues like traffic congestion and parking. So they're sort of highlighting the idea that, there's currently not a revenue-generating mechanism focused on businesses.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
More. No, I'm done. Done for the moment.
Okay.
So one of the other things I was going to bring up is what you just brought up, Liz, and that is the sunset. So there are other measures, if I'm not in error here, is that there are measures that either sunset or they have a renewal period. So they go back to the voters for a renewal. Are there not?
Well, there's really no distinction between the two. So the way a sunset provision works, or a measure that ultimately gets renewed, is that it has a sunset provision. On that date, the measure expires, and then what is typically referred to as a renewal is essentially a new measure that replaces the old measure.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So that's one way this could be addressed. We talked earlier about the shovel-ready aspect of it, my term for it. I think what may not be as clear as could be when we actually do a campaign, if we go forward with this year, is that this is a tax on business for the benefit of business, with also the benefit on residents as we move around the community. And the other thing that isn't mentioned anywhere is every one of our, at least to this point in time, every one of our comp plan, and maybe that's the sunset to tie it to, perhaps, but every one of our comp plan scenarios identifies millions of square feet of additional office space in the term of the comp plan. So, it's not like this problem is going to get better without some assistance. The TMA can take care of some of that, but can the TMA take care of all of that? It's barely in its infancy stage. So I'm not opposing funding, at least part of the funding for the TMA, but I'm not sure if that's going to cover all of this. So I think we need to consider the comp plan scenarios in consideration of this as well.
So I'll just offer a few initial thoughts. One, on this issue around whether this measure would help support really both of our TMAs, the downtown TMA, which we had a very valuable report on last Monday that basically showed what it could do, but it also, it was in response to the council having received a report 3 months prior that was a much more conservative, cautious, less ambitious program for the TMA that basically wouldn't have solved the problem because it was reliant upon donations and grants from the business community, and it's pretty clear that it's not going to, the downtown TMA would not be able to fund itself in a way that would actually be able to achieve the council set priority of the 30% single occupancy vehicle reduction. We also actually had a discussion around whether the boundaries of the TMA should be expanded to include the SOFA area, which would add above the 1.3 million. And we do have some potential revenue for the TMA from parking. So this is not the only funding source for the TMA, but I certainly would continue to support this measure, having the TMA funding as one of its, the downtown TMA and its expansion, actually, hopefully in the Cal Ave.
Interrupt, but the motion is on the board that was the original motion.
Yeah, and it's more broadly worded, so you'd have to, I mean, the transportation demand management would be inclusive of the TMA efforts, both the downtown and the research park, but not limited to. So all along, and even in our last meeting, the only argument I had was when folks implied that the downtown TMA was the sole or principal purpose of this measure, and that's what I disagreed with. I continue to believe that it's an important purpose of the measure, and that as we go, one of the things that we want to look at what we ask staff to do in preparation for our next council meeting on this is guidance on what's more meat on the bone on what things would be funded by this, because that's one area that we all have recognized we have only addressed at a high level so far. Flip side of that TMA argument is that if it is fully funded, what we saw on Monday is that we could have a really significant impact. So without the funding, things are bad and they're going to get worse, and with the funding, we could have a really significant impact. And unfortunately, we don't have good data on what that impact would be. Ed, if there's any way that our transportation staff can give any guidance to the council on trend lines of what will happen in the foreseeable future if we don't kind of turn the tide on our how we generate trips, and there's probably two milestones or two ways to look at it. How bad will it get in, say, 2 years if we don't get started sooner rather than later? And how bad will it get if we never do anything? And I think that's really what we and the voters are facing. Then I'd Karen was kind of alluding to the comp plan, and I think one of the considerations that both we and the business community should be thinking about is that in the absence of us addressing our traffic problems at a local level in a meaningful way soon, what will be the attitude of the residents toward development in the community? What scenarios in the comp plan would the community insist upon if we're not addressing the traffic problems and really essentially solving them? And I suspect that we would have a really different comp plan environment and political environment if we don't solve these problems. And that's one of the arguments that I've made, that the business community needs to make sure they're not being short-sighted, in that, yes, they could take an opposition to this measure, and in doing so, we heard that that would potentially harm the VTA measure if the business community took an active opposition to, if we put this on the ballot and they took an active opposition. One of the things that we heard, but it hasn't been spoken about more, is that that would potentially harm the VTA measure. So it's something to think about. And then just more broadly and longer term is that we've seen that the concern of the community over this issue, and if we don't solve the problem, what's going to be the trend line of the political sentiment of the community toward the of the resident community toward the business community and toward future development. And I would posit that it's going to be really different if we don't solve the problem than if we do. So anyway.
Might I add something to that? Because I was at a regional meeting yesterday, and just as an addendum to this, a reminder that Menlo Park right now has approved hundreds of thousands of square feet of office and so forth, which I'm sure you're all very aware of. But as has Mountain View, as has Sunnyvale, and yesterday what I was hearing was, again, we may not think Cupertino impacts us, but it does.
Of course it does.
So we're a regional situation at this point. And I think when we look at this, we're going to have to solve our problem at home. I don't think we can put walls up at either end, between us and the neighboring communities. But at the same time, I think we need to attack our own problem now, here. And I'm delighted about VTA. I will be very surprised if the VTA tax doesn't pass. At the same time, I'm not sure the money is going to come rolling in before 2018.
I just say, I think that's the argument why the VTA measure and this one are necessary complementary measures, but that would be part of a political argument.
And if that's true, it's our job to sell it.
That's right.
That's right.
Greg?
So I think that the argument is, well, I think it's clear that we need to do something. I don't disagree with that, for all the reasons Pat just stated. However, I think there's some risks involved of how we do it and the structure it takes. I mean, I think the real question is, do we shoot for 2018 with a possibility of 2017 if the business community was on board, there was no opposition? So in my mind, it's whether or not we do it in 2017 or 2018, with frankly 2018 being more likely because it's not a 2/3 measure. But maybe you could get there. So the question about, first thing is, how much time do we actually lose by doing 2018? So I would like the staff report to really take a hard look at that and ask the question, if we're not going to start this anyway until January 1st, 2018, enforcement, and that's what I heard Ed say. If we had everything lined up for a 2018 measure, frankly, could we start January 1st, 2019? So how much time do we really lose? Then, in terms of the funding of the TMA, I don't recall exactly the time frame on that, but I recall they either had a 3-year or a 5-year plan. If we got them the money earlier, say we passed it in 2016, but we didn't start funding until 2018, because that's when we talked about the earliest we could do it, or we started funding 2019, if that's a possibility with staff. I want staff to look at that and how that funding works and how much time we actually lose. Because the strongest argument that people make for why we should put this on the 2016 ballot is that we need to do something now. And so I'd like staff to take a look and see how that actually breaks down and how that works as part of it. I also think it's a really important argument to keep in our mind that this is really soft support for this. And that if there is an active, well-funded opposition campaign to this, we could lose this. And if this gets lost, then there's don't have the money to move forward on this, and it won't happen, and nothing will occur. Whereas if we plan this out, tell people exactly what we're going to do, it's not rushed, you go on 2018, on the 2018 ballot, and hopefully then there is no opposition whatsoever to it, because everyone knows what the money's going to be used for, everyone can understand that, then it passes, the community comes together. And the question is what we did with the TOT is we actually spent the time, identified the projects, came up with how do you actually solve the problem. One of the things we sit here and we say is we need to do something, and we say we need to solve traffic. I don't know what that means. I don't think anyone here knows. And coming up with a list of projects may not be the projects that solve that traffic. And I worry that if we tell the voters really quickly, this is what we're going to do, and those aren't the right projects, then we've not used this opportunity wisely. It may, in fact, be better to tell the voters, we are going to then come up with a plan of what we're going to do, and we're going to have a process to do that, but then we're still spending the time coming up with a plan and not spending the money, and we might as well go with 2018. So I think that's a real decision point we need to make. Do we have staff identify projects that could be done? And I guess I should ask staff, given the short time frame, are those the projects that will give us the biggest bang for the buck in reducing traffic congestion? Or would staff need more time? And my experience in Palo Alto is that staff needs a lot of time to identify. They have to hire a consultant. They have to go through what is causing the traffic. You know, what is actually going to get people out of their cars? What's going to make this work? And I don't think we have the time to do that, but I'd like the staff report to address that. And if I'm wrong, that's great. I also think brinksmanship is a dangerous game on the VTA tax. And you know, who knows what happens between now and November in terms of the economy, in terms of what happens. The VTA tax is polling really well, but if there is a strong campaign against this and it hurts the VTA tax, that would be very unfortunate. But that doesn't mean that there won't be a strong campaign against it. And tell the business community not to run a strong campaign against this. They may or may not listen. And I think we could lose both this and the VTA tax. And I think that would be very, very unfortunate. And so I think there's a bunch of trade-offs going in. For me, it's a trade-off of 2018 versus 2016. So I think we just need to think that through and say, and make a decision. And I think obviously the council will have to weigh in on it.
Did you leave out 17 on purpose?
Well, so I think 2017 would be fantastic. I mean, if I could, you know, if I was basically in charge and I could make it happen the way I'd want it, I'd want a specific tax which takes a 2/3 majority anyway that says this is what we're going to do. These are the projects we're doing. This is what the money will be used for, and therefore it takes 2/3 anyway. We put it on 2017 and we go forward. But I haven't seen the indication yet. And if the business community came and said they would spend the money and they'd support it, and we'd all go forward on this in a kumbaya moment, then 2017 would be wonderful. But I'm skeptical of 2017 for those reasons. I mean, I think that's a little overly optimistic. Doesn't mean it couldn't happen. But in 2018, I'm convinced we can pass this, make it happen, and just like we did with the IBRIC and with the TOT, and we have a plan and everyone knows what the plan is. Whereas on this, I feel much more uncomfortable with it. So I'd like the staff report to address those kind of concerns. And I'd like them to talk about the soft support issues. And, you know, and the fact that if an organized opposition, And I really don't see, I mean, I thought your comment was really, Mark Berman and Larry Klein raised, what, $5,000? Given that there's an assembly race going on, there's a council race going on, I don't see a lot of people giving towards passing this, frankly. And I could be wrong, but I think that's a decision we need to highlight, and people need to feel on their own of how that goes. And then I think the whole staff report about how this is implemented, how much time, what is the timeline if we say go forward on, is it the 27th? Of what that looks like. What staff needs to get in place, what council needs to do, and what it's going to take to get this on the ballot and then to get it implemented. So those are really what I'd like the staff report to highlight. I'm sure there's other things people have.
Karen?
Nothing at this second.
Okay, let's see, I had a few things. One, I did happen to have the TMA report, and they didn't specify a starting date. They had a year 1, year 2, year 3. And basically, year 1 is with the current funding level approximately, and they're talking about a 3% single occupancy vehicle reduction. Year 2 is $1 million and a 15%. But part of this is it's not a direct correlation between dollars spent; it's a ramping up of programs as well. But year 3 would be achieving the 30% reduction with a $1.3 million expenditure. I think that it would be appropriate for us to assume that we're going to have some parking revenue. We don't know what that might be, and we've still got quite a few months before we're going to have the staff report on the downtown parking study. End of year. So unfortunately, we don't know what measures will look best in the revenue. I have my own ballparks, but I would say that it's reasonable to assume a good chunk of the TMA dollars could come from parking, and another chunk would have to be either from another source, such as this, or not funded. I also, from my own assumption, is that the TMA does need to expand to really have the community impact. First, in the downtown, it needs to include SOFA, and then not too distant future, it needs to include Cal Ave and maybe other areas. And so then we're looking at a TMA that probably would need to have $2 million or more in a budget to accomplish similar outcomes to what they're planning, what they presented on Monday, and some fraction of that funded by parking and some fraction by hopefully this measure. I also agree that
Pat, just a quick comment on that. I think from the very first time I can remember us discussing, whether it's TDM, whether it's TMA, whatever it was, we have known that as a city we would need to support it. If we really want it to happen, we've really got to be, I think, the impetus behind that.
I also am not assuming, as Greg, that 2017 and a 2/3 majority is much of a likelihood as to what we do, because we see from the VTA efforts that how hard it is to pass a 2/3, and the reason that it happens in Santa Clara County is because there is a large, very well-funded, very influential organization of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group that has led the charge of those campaigns. Without that, those would never have passed. And we don't have that here. We actually, I was glad to hear the chamber say that today that they haven't taken a position, because last week in the meeting we heard a pretty strident opposition to a measure that we didn't even have determined as to what we would be recommending, and we already had the strident opposition. And frankly, it reminded me of the opposition of the chamber that we've had to essentially every measure that we've had on the TOT increases, our office cap, to the form of the RPP that we had, and so I'm not sanguine on expecting that the chamber, given more time, would be strong supporters, and for that matter, not opponents to whatever we put forward, whenever we put it forward, because so far that hasn't been the history. I was more hopeful on this one, and then with what I heard last week, I frankly became a lot more skeptical as to that the chamber would see what I think is in everyone's long-term interest on this, and including with the way that we have it framed with small business exemptions and medium-sized business discounts, which we thought were pretty responsive, in particular to most of the downtown employers. Although for this, if we did choose to put it on this fall, yes, we heard that some of the support was soft, but on the other hand, it's 66% on something that requires a simple majority. So I don't know whether are our pollsters still on the line?
Are you still on Miranda? She may have dropped off. She's at the airport.
So the question really is, based on this support level that we're seeing here, what sort of, as a starting point, what kind of confidence is there that we could pass a simple majority in the fall based on what we know so far? I mean, nobody has a pure crystal ball. I don't know if you have any sense.
It's hard to quantify. I mean, I think the key question there is what is the strength and funding behind the opposition campaign that could potentially undermine that support. And I don't have an easy way to put a number to that.
Yep.
So if I could just follow up on that, I think the definite yes being only 36% is the key factor. And as part of that 65, you're doing the undecided who lean yes. I don't know what that means, but I'm assuming, and tell me if I'm wrong, that's 8% is fairly weak.
Yes, absolutely.
That 8% is very much, so that really gets you down to, what is it, 58%? So on slide 4. And so then if you turn 10% of the 22, or 7 or 8% of them, you lose that 50%.
Well, yeah, but that means you've subtracted all the undecided lean yes,
Right.
all the undecided, and all the undecided lean yes.
No, I just, you're right, I did subtract all the
Yes,
undecided. So there is that
subtract
extra 6%.
well, there's 14% that you left out. So we have basically 58% that are either definitely or probably yes. 58%. And then another 14% that are essentially in the undecided category, and over half of those are already leaning yes. Now, that doesn't mean you can assume that all those will vote yes, but that's what the data says.
Right. I agree with you.
Okay. Karen?
So a couple of things. One is looking at the time here, and this conversation merits the time that it takes, but also wondering how we're going to encapsulate what we're going to forward to council. So the structure of that, if we could get to that. And then also one of the things, Greg mentioned several things he thought would be important to bring to staff. I think one of the important data points to take to the council is if we look at the comp plan scenarios for office growth, even assuming a 30% reduction in traffic, how much incremental increase in traffic that's going to bring. Do you know what I'm saying?
I do. I think the question I'd ask in response is whether you would want or expect the staff report to be able to answer that question, or to describe what it would take to get an answer to that question. Because quite frankly, I think that, let me describe exactly. It's really the type of analysis that is the essence of the environmental impact report for the comp plan, or more generally, the traffic modeling involved.
So it seems to me that you could, staff could extrapolate some numbers out of, current history and stuff that wouldn't be that complicated. And they could be like a range, very high level. They could be a range of impact. We can't pretend that there's not going to be additional impact just because there's a 30% reduction, assuming that. And I'm not trying to be skeptical of that, but let's just assume the 30%.
Well,
it's still going to be an impact.
So you're talking comp plan, which is a longer time horizon. It might, so we might have really two questions along those lines. What would be the longer term impact? And that would be more complicated because it would be dependent to some degree on which scenario we would
Right.
have. And then, but they might be able to have a little, a single scenario of what would happen over the next 2 years based upon trend lines.
That too.
And that might be more obtainable.
I
Not
would,
with precision.
exactly, and I guess I'm cautious to not overweigh in on this, but then from a professional perspective, I would have to
As a
share.
former
Traffic engineer,
Right.
can't help but note, we've got multiple factors, I suppose, multiple variables that are coming into the discussion. The growth, development growth is certainly part of it. It's the way people travel, and whether it be changes in mode. There is the impact on the improvements that are happening, such as whether it be BART or any other regional transportation changes that are happening, as well as and growth that's happening outside of the city, and as has been raised previously as well, because those are big impacts locally. The other that really hasn't been discussed is what dollar resources are available, and in particular with the VTA, the one piece that I think we can and should do some additional homework on is the local streets component, which I understand is, I was just looking online, I think it's $1.2 billion share. And the expectation was that to the extent that any city has a pavement condition that's above a certain threshold, that those dollars could be used for other transportation purposes. And so how that would actually translate into real dollars for Palo Alto, I think is an area that we need to do a little more homework on, and that we can answer as a part of what comes back to council on the 27th.
That'd be very helpful.
And I did a back of the napkin back a month or two ago on that, and I'd be really interested in staff doing a better job than my napkin. But if I'm recalling correctly, I was ballparking based upon our population and the dollars per year it might be in the $1 million a year that would come to the city for all those purposes, which is not insignificant.
But doesn't happen right away either.
That's right. We
That's
can't
been
forget.
one of my long-term concerns.
Yeah, that's what I was going to
So
go
how
to
much
too.
money
Is that?
quickly?
Excuse me, just a second. So, yeah, that's one of the things I was going to bring up. Is that the VTA measure is over 30 years, and so it is the long-term impact of that. So,
And you hope the economy doesn't change.
exactly. So, just besides the information that I've just put out there, I think it'd be important for the council to have and the public to have. That we also haven't said anything really about an oversight committee. I think that's critical.
I meant to say that.
It's
Yes,
absolutely
I agree.
critical. I mean, we would be foolish and irresponsible, if I can be so bold as to say that, if we didn't require that. The composition of that should, it seems to me, to get a little finer grain, but it seems to me it should be, well, actually, I don't want to go there right now. Is it resident? Is it resident and business combination? Is it, what is the composition of that? But we absolutely have to have an oversight committee, and it has to report to council. The other thing is sunset, I think is critical to this. You said the polling would go up significantly with that, and I'm sort of suggesting that it be along the lines of the comp plan life. I mean, that's 2030, so 2018 would be an election year. So we could look at, do we reconsider this in 2018 to continue or not? So there's an opportunity to do that. But I think
You don't mean 2018.
2028, I mean, sorry. Yeah, 2028. So maybe that's too long a horizon, but it just seems like it's kind of a natural marriage of the two. So, and then I'm looking forward to how the mayor wants to structure our comments to get these to council as well.
Well, in the last part, I think that if we see that we have consensus, then we don't necessarily have to have this, and the staff can, at wrap-up, to see if what they captured is what we all agree on, that we want them to try to present as much of this for the council meeting as they can, with an appreciation that they're not going to be able to.
Well, lag time, I think, is a really important aspect of this. I mean, we've brought that up, and lag time is a really important aspect.
Yeah. Two things I would add to that, though, because I think that our business community did come this morning, and I think I heard that they do support the TMA, and I also heard support for a sunset. So there may be more of an agreement with business on this than we might think. And I hope we will hold that as a good possibility.
Yeah, Molly?
Mr. Chair, thank you. City Attorney Molly Stump. So I know that everybody's taking notes here on the various items that would need to be brought forward to council, but just for the committee's consideration as you wind up your discussion today, one thing that we are going to need to have council address if a decision is made to continue to explore or to move forward with this fall's ballot is what is council's plan to be available to work with staff to give more precise policy guidance through the month of July so that we can have a full measure drafted and approved by council. We will try to bring forward various policy areas where we will need guidance. We did provide an initial kind of list to the committee the last time we met, and we've heard a number of additional items today, a sunset, an oversight committee, and there may be additional things. We'll try to frame those for council for the 27th in the event that you do your earlier items on timing and those kinds of things lead to an interest in this fall's ballot. But we will not be able to get all of the guidance that we need from our elected officials in that one meeting, so we will need a plan for council to work with staff in July.
So I think that brings up a really good point. We have anticipated a little bit of what the measure would look like, but council's never agreed. So I think when we do the staff report, I mean, it could be, you know, that we don't exempt smaller businesses, that we do, that it's 10, you know, it's 5 employees, 10 employees. I mean, I think there's a range, and I think obviously this committee talked about, was it anything under 10 employees is exempted, if I recall, and then between 10 and 50, it's 50%. Mm-hmm. But I mean, council never weighed in on that. So I think it's important to highlight that's what the committee talked about, but there are obviously lots of options. And then I do think a lot of that information you provided us, which was what are the businesses that are above 50? Mm-hmm. You had a list of them, and who they are, and I think a lot of them are in the research park, frankly, but there are some downtown. And then we talked a little bit about, or someone made some comments about, is it a full FTE or is it actually an employee, so part-time employees? I think we, as a group, if I recall, talked more that it was an FTE kind of concept as opposed to an employee, so it adds up part-time employees. But I think those are all these issues that need to be highlighted for council to weigh in on in the structure of this. I mean, I think it's going to be a long staff report.
Well, that is one area that we probably should see whether we actually want to offer the council a consensus on if they were to adopt or pursue a tax measure this fall, what would be the form? And let me just ask this, under that condition, so that's separate from whether the council should put on the ballot, but just if they did, what would be the form? We have the up to 10 employees exempt, 11 to 50 at a $50 rate, and above 50 at 100. And then they would be FTEs working in Palo Alto. And was there one other issue you raised related to it? But are we in agreement that if there was a measure, that would be the structure that we would recommend, or do we want to leave it open to the council to debate that?
I'd rather leave it open. I wanted to finish what I was saying. I thought your comments were really helpful. But I wanted to say, I actually was wanting to know, looking at that, what the different structures would raise. One of the concerns I have with our structure, frankly, that I have to think a little bit about, is that here we are funding the TMA on here, possibly on California Avenue, possibly expanding to SOFA, but yet most of the businesses that are paying for it are frankly in the research park. And there's a little bit of a disconnect there, and I need to think a little bit about that. And I'd like to understand, you know, maybe that's the wrong structure. Maybe the structure should be different. Maybe it should be, you know, if you're above 25, not 50. So I wanted to think a little bit about that, understand how much money we raise too, and have some sense of how much money we need.
So, actually, that
one thing in the middle. This is such it's so urgent, but it's also so encompassing. I'm wondering if we don't need another meeting sometime that last week to really flush this out for the entire council.
Okay.
I just
let's
can't imagine
consider
how
that
we
as
can
we
do
go.
that
Okay.
in an hour and a half
Let's consider
or two.
that. So one, this issue, of wanting to look at whether it be the research park and those employers or the rest of the city, both in terms of the traffic that exists there. Not all our traffic problems are in the downtown and Cal Ave areas, and fairness. So both addressing the problems where they exist and the fairness. And this actually is a big part of why I was at a different position last week, that this thing is not dedicated to the downtown TMA and never was the council direction to do that. But the downtown TMA was a major focus of it. And that's the distinction, and that would be my response. And then that goes into, if we look at, say, $1.5 million for the downtown TMA, including SOFA, to get it done. And whether it's a third of that, or say it came from parking and $1 million came from this. I mean, we've got different scenarios we could consider. That, and if there was $5 million raised by this measure, then that leaves $4 million for a whole bunch of other things. And my argument would be that the research park their TMA is far better funded and further along than our downtown. And we'll see data shortly on the effectiveness of a whole bunch of really promising programs that they're doing. But I would say I'd prefer to have whatever the dollars from this measure might go to the research park to be additive to whatever they were otherwise going to do, as opposed to replace those dollars.
That resonates.
And one of the areas that when they had asked this challenge, when Greg and I met with them a few weeks ago, well, what really would be in it for the research park? And I went back and thought about one, and this is by no means the only one, but I think it's actually a significant capital investment. So a lot of what we're looking at is services, but this can also go to certain capital. So preceding our great discussion around the bike overpass on 101 by Adobe Creek, we actually had identified a bike underpass under Caltrain at approximately at Loma Verde 10 or 12 years ago. That South Palo Alto has no pedestrian grade separation south of, there is none in our city, south of California Avenue. And that's a really meaningful one. In our discussion of the crosstown bike corridor, one of the pushbacks has been, well, you want to have this midtown bike corridor, but it ends at Alma. And we didn't make much of a case. Said, yeah, but long term, we actually intend to cross under the tracks there and hook up with Marguerite and Matadero. And that route that's already part of our bike master plan is upgrade to on the east side of Alma, the Midtown corridor. On the west side, Marguerite and Matadero are major parts of the bike master plan, and it hits a T into the bike path that comes out of the Stanford Research Park. I had always envisioned that undercrossing as principally being the pedestrian connection between South Palo Alto and West Palo Alto for residents. But I now am appreciating that it is a potential great bike corridor and pedestrian corridor, but principally bike, into the Stanford Research Park as well. And that bike path, I don't know how well you know it, it comes right out essentially at Hanover and opens up to the whole research park and would open up all of South Palo Alto with essentially 2 traffic signals, one at Loma Verde and one at El Camino, would open up the whole research park. It would be a fast bike route. So that's one not insignificant example of a project that could be funded here. We could take, we all know that grants come forward when you have half the funds or whatever locally. So we could bond, say, we could bond $300,000 or $400,000 out of this $5 million, and probably come up with half the dollars needed for that, or we could pay for the whole thing, bond it. something that otherwise would be sitting out there for another decade or more looking for funds, it could actually happen as a result here. So that's actually one of the more concrete examples that I think would resonate well with residents, and hopefully would also fit in well with the Stanford Research Park, who is actually looking at significant expansion of the bike system and bike mode share as part of their transportation demand management measures. And frankly, we as a city neglected them when we set up our bike master plan. It was like the research park wasn't in the city. And I realized that a year and a half ago and said, how the heck did that happen?
Just to refresh my memory on what the research park currently has in place for because I know you two visited and had a discussion about their traffic plan.
Well, their TMA is multifaceted. They just bought VTA Eco Passes for the vast majority of employees in the park. They are expanding the Marguerite shuttle. They have both a ride share website and the Scoop app.
All through the research park.
And they're looking at a shared regional bus system, private, whereas those companies, a lot of them are big, but not big enough to have their own fleet up to San Francisco, and support of expanded the Dumbarton and VTA buses that are express buses there. So it's got a lot of different stuff going on, and they've funded. We found that something recently that was very surprising, that essentially the research park for most of their tenants essentially has a form of taxing authority. They can pass on, and we can hear from research park people a little more clarity on this, but they can pass on essentially like a triple net lease, is my understanding of kind of shared costs to do a lot of this TMA stuff. And then some of it is being borne by the individual companies and some by their TMA itself.
Well, then it's worth a conversation with them as well as we go forward with this, because I know you two had the advantage of that conversation, but neither Karen nor I have done that. But
Pat and I were sitting in the meeting.
Pardon me?
Pat and I were the ones that went to the meeting with Research Park.
Yeah, I think Greg and I had another follow-up.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Oh, okay. No, I thought it was...
It was a little different subject matter. The
Okay.
one we were in was specifically this, and then
Right.
On the tax measure, and the other was more on the
All right,
TMA.
thank you.
So could we just briefly, because I've just brought it up, discuss the aspect of another meeting
Before the
sometime in that
27th.
last week before we, somehow this is a meeting that I'd like to see the public involved in as well, and well advertised in that way. And I guess it's because I certainly hear a lot about housing, but what I hear about from the most people most of the time is just how terrible the traffic was. Frequently it's how terrible the traffic was coming to meet me, in fact, and just, why they're late because the traffic was so terrible. And be that as it may, I think it's an issue that we really need to get on very directly.
Okay, so let's talk briefly about first whether we think it's a good idea to try and have that meeting, and if so, when. So part of the problem is that I am in DC. I leave
when are you going?
I leave on midday.
When are you going? I
on,
thought you said, where are you going?
I leave midday or late morning on Tuesday and come back Thursday night, and then I'm at a conference all day on Friday. So
and then
evenings,
we start our break.
Yeah, so
it would need Monday day.
yeah.
This is Thursday.
Wait a minute. Where are you right now?
Talking about next week. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure staff will have anything for us by the Monday. I think that's
That's the only
unrealistic.
time it's left.
And Pat, so you're leaving on the 28th to go east?
No, on the 21st. The 28th is after the council meeting. So are you thinking?
Right.
Oh, you're thinking a meeting after we.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, I
after the council
misunderstood.
meeting?
Well, I'm thinking we don't take this up at the Monday council meeting. We schedule it for an entire meeting after I don't possibly see how we can get to
When
any
does break
conclusion.
start?
27th.
So you want to have a council meeting, you want to delay break?
No, I thought we started, no, I think we
After break
officially
is what
said
he's
it
saying.
started
She's-
on that Friday. I'm almost sure. I don't see,
Yeah, July 2nd.
yeah, it doesn't, so we're
So
still
you were
in
probably
session.
counting on those that week, but officially it doesn't start until July 2nd.
Beth, weren't you earlier polling, at least some of us, for?
Oh, so you're thinking of having another council meeting on the 28th, 29th, or the 30th?
That's what she's
Well,
saying.
somewhere in there.
Beth was
Okay.
asking us
Because
earlier
that
if we could
makes
do it
more sense to
28th.
me. We've got an incredible amount of stuff, as I recall, Ed, and so forth, to cover in the next 2 meetings. Now, if I'm wrong, and that's not the case, and we could actually thrash it out on the 27th, that would be fine. I just don't know that we are.
No, we were, though, talking about a follow-up. We have penciled in the possibility of a follow-up city council meeting.
The 28th.
On the 28th.
If that was already penciled in?
Yes.
Oh, good. I didn't know that, so. Or did I? I didn't know that, did I?
I was confused. I thought you wanted a committee meeting. That was my
No,
confusion.
no,
So
I'm
you wanted
talking
to
about
put
a
the
full council.
You're talking about full council?
Full council.
Okay, I was confused, too.
I'm talking about the
Okay,
whole
so under that
9 yards.
context of a full council meeting, we put the 28th as a placeholder if we needed for various matters to try and wrap up before vacation. And so this certainly could be one of them.
Just, our pollsters have indicated they're not available the 28th.
So we have to do this meeting on the 27th. We have to do this item on the 27th.
Consideration.
Some of the other items.
Well,
we
that's
moved
right.
to the
Then we could
28th.
do this on the 27th and the rest of our stuff on the 28th, right?
That's a possibility.
That's what we were discussing.
Yeah.
Good. And that's a real possibility. But I think we really need a full discussion with council and lots of public input at the same time. So it'd be good if we could widely advertise that.
Okay.
So are we agreed we could do that? Switch the two?
Yeah, probably we have to look at, so whether other council items would move
Is the
from...
28th when you said you'd be gone though, Pat? Or is
No,
it the
no,
previous,
it's a week
previous
before.
week? Okay.
Yeah. We'd have to look at moving other items that are currently scheduled for the 27th to the 28th, so that this could be on the
Yeah.
27th and have more time. Okay.
Bert,
Yes.
City Attorney Stump and Assistant City Manager Chikata and I were discussing that this morning about possibly moving at least three of the items on the 27th to the 28th so that we could accommodate this item
On the 27th?
on the 27th.
So you're way ahead of us?
We're trying to be.
Way ahead.
An hour, maybe.
Yeah.
One item on the 27th is the Buena Vista Memorandum of Understanding, and I think that item needs to stay on the 27th, but there were some others.
Yeah, and it's not like everything would have to move, right? Okay.
And one more suggestion I might make, and glad to have it shut down, but since we often hear from the business community that if we have it at night, many of them have already gone home, we might think of starting that one again at 5, even 4.
I'd say
getting
5.
toward
Vacation, and that would include,
So that's the 27th meeting.
yeah.
The 27th begins at 5 already, the 28th, with whatever moves, we could see about starting that one at 5 o'clock also, just to accommodate
Well, I
council,
think
if we could.
Sorry. The 27th is what Liz was talking about, having this item at 5 to
Exactly.
accommodate the business
Yes,
community.
right.
And then the 28th wouldn't necessarily have to start that early unless we had such a full agenda. And
Right.
when we were looking at, unless it's changed, when we were looking at it before, we were debating whether we needed the 28th. So I suspect we wouldn't need a 5 o'clock start if we have that for the 28th.
Yeah, and I know that what happens at the end of the year is we throw a whole lot of stuff in those last 2 agendas.
Mhm.
Although one thing got pulled off, I think,
Yeah,
for
so
Monday night.
when we were last looking at this,
Yeah.
and staff may have a further update, we had a very full agenda for the 27th,
Right.
but not so full that it was clear we were going to need the 28th. It was still debated. So if we're doing both, I suspect we're in pretty good shape in terms of being able to handle all the material.
Okay.
All right, so should we refresh and see if we're aligned on what we
Should
want.
we refresh? I don't
Ask,
think that, right?
ask staff to give us,
Yes.
to give council as much direction as they're able, or as much information as they're able to on the 27th. Let me run off what I had down. The issue of oversight and a sunset. And is that something that we, on each of these, we can see whether any of these are ones that we actually have a consensus recommendation, or we just want to leave it open-ended for the
You want
council?
to take those one at a time?
Yeah, so Oversight Committee, is there anybody who's not in favor of that? No. Yeah. So then we have a question of the form. Do we think it would be appropriate to have both business and residents in the oversight?
Oh, yes.
I'm saying this because I think it's a given, but I want to
yeah,
put it
yes,
out there
yeah.
so that we actually.
Consensus,
yeah,
yes,
Okay,
yeah.
good. You agree? Great. I do. Yeah, okay. Second, do we think that a sunset would be an appropriate thing for us to recommend?
Yes.
I agree.
And so council will need ultimately to determine when that
Yes,
sunset is.
Right, and Greg's looks like not so certain, is that right?
Well,
We can leave, anything we're not in
okay,
agreement.
I would just leave it open. I
Okay.
probably am there, but.
Yeah, so anything that is not kind of an easy consensus, we'll simply put
That
out
sounds
there
like
as an issue
three
to
and
the
a half,
council.
4.
Yeah, but we don't need to push getting a recommendation.
Right.
If we got
Yes,
consensus,
good-
we'll
yeah,
give it.
good
If
point.
it's
Yeah.
contentious, we'll let the council decide. Okay, we want staff to estimate the revenue that they believe. We had a prelim last week, but
Yes.
put a little more meat on that bone.
Yeah.
And at one point, we threw out 6 million. Is that still a?
Last week,
rational?
they came back thinking it was closer to 5, based on what their preliminary
Okay.
was. Then the form of the tax. We had just gone through, this scenario that we've had of would we whatever we recommend isn't as if it's in some way binding on the council, but do we want to say that our consensus was to look at the 1 to 10 employee exempt, 11 to 50 at $50 and full rate of 100 at over 50, and these are full-time equivalents working in Palo Alto. Is that a framework we have consensus on? If not,
So no.
okay, then let's leave it alone.
Mayor Burt?
Yes.
So the council will want to consider whether there's some kind of a inflation adjuster, or is this a flat tax that will
Good
remain
point.
for the term of the
Okay,
tax?
so we'll put that out for the council as well.
And working
Good.
in Palo Alto, does it mean working anywhere in Palo Alto? As in the modern, many of our modern workplaces, folks work from home periodically, and so we would draft it to count those hours.
Oh, so if it's a Palo Alto employer, and then they have employees who are some portion of the time working from home
In Palo Alto.
in Palo Alto.
Or elsewhere.
Would that
Good
make
I think
question.
the definition is the key point.
Yes.
Definition of an
Okay, well,
employee.
we won't be trying to decide that today, but that's a good issue to
We'll
bring
define
forward.
that, yeah. And then the escalator.
Yeah, any escalator. A timing of actual enactment of the tax, as Greg was raising those issues. And
Are you meaning enactment, or you mean when it
not
could be
the
implemented?
legal enactment, but
Yeah,
I
when it
mean
could be implemented.
implementation.
Implementation,
That's
yes.
a better way.
Call it the effective date of the tax, right?
Okay. Well,
No, it's when.
It's collection, really, right, when the collection occurs.
Yeah.
Well, I
Yeah.
think it's two different things. It's when the collection occurs is one thing, but then when it actually gets implemented, they're two different things.
Yes, they are two different things.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So presumably it would be January 1, but it could also be July 1. But
For
then it's when
collections.
does it begin?
Yeah,
Yes.
but then the program couldn't start until, I think we were generally saying maybe 6 months after.
I'm not sure I understand the distinction. Do we mean expenditures by program?
No.
Tax collection, so that we could then expend.
When does it first start, and then when is it due on an annual basis thereafter?
I see. When is it collected versus when the program's...
Okay, and then for staff to provide more information on prospective uses of the tax. Yes.
Another set of issues involve the standard enforcement procedures, and there are many that are standard, but maybe one that's not standard is what would be, so self-reporting, appeal procedures, audit authority, refunds, interest and penalties for late payments, civil enforcement, criminal enforcement. Those are policy questions that council.
Okay, so if you could bring forward kind of what exists in other jurisdictions typically. Okay, and then we also had some interest in whatever staff can provide on the traffic impacts if over the next couple of years without the measure, and the longer term impacts with an appreciation that you may not be able to have great data on that.
Quantify, right.
Yeah.
Do I not recall that at some point you gave us background on the business taxes or similar in other communities? Do I not remember this from some time back?
We have not been asked, and we did not do survey work, except for very informally at a staff level. We have not brought that
Oh,
forward.
okay. I think that's an awful lot to ask you to do, but it would be interesting to have just kind of a quick look at what exists in the rest of the county. But I'm not saying please add that in. I'm just saying that certainly would be interesting, but I know time is really tight.
I would add that I'd be interested in cities, wherever they are, that have headcount taxes, what theirs are.
Yeah, and that's headcount or business tax.
They
either way.
vary. Each one is unique.
Yeah.
So we can focus on the county. There is also another approach that tries to look at similar types of measures throughout the state, to the extent there are.
To the extent you have that information, both.
The League of Cities actually might have some, as well as the state controller's
office. On
office.
this very short turnaround, we will do what we can.
Okay, I know
realize it's
Councilmember Holman has a 12 o'clock drop dead, so anything else that we...
One thing.
Yeah.
I was hoping we could now get costs of running the measure, that kind of stuff. So when we say it was going to raise $5 million, I mean, if it's de minimis, it's not. But suddenly, when I was listening to Molly talk, I thought this might be more than $100,000 to do this, to administer it. So the cost of administration, and then in terms of the timing, I thought you captured it, but it's not just. I'd also like to see if we put it on 2018 versus that, how that affects things.
How it affects the implementation.
The implementation,
Got
the timing.
Okay, good.
Match up with the TMA, all that kind of stuff.
Yep. All right, does that cover?
Because it's going to be for the public to consume too, of course, do we want to say anything about how this, say more about how this marries with the VTA tax?
I think that's such an extensive analysis. I'd love to see it too, but I think
Well, I don't mean analysis. I mean just in terms of description, because right now the public has to go on as the polling question.
Just framing it that way at a high level, you're saying.
Okay, maybe at a high level.
I think
That's
we
a
could
hard one.
speak to it in terms of...
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Anybody have anything else?
And you will go through the polling results.
I canceled my 12
Oh, yeah.
o'clock thing.
Well, mine was really at 11:30 because we'd be
Okay.
gone
That
at
was fine.
11:30. So,
I just-
yeah.
All right.
I had to
So
get my
well,
button finally.
there was one.
I think we should send this polling results to the full council now. I noticed. I
Sure.
think we were the only ones who got
Sure.
it, and I thought.
Yep.
So one other thing, which was, never mind. I think we covered it. Never mind.
Okay. Meeting's adjourned.
Thank you.
They would get it in.